So we've all been there. You're reading through some code trying to understand what a function is doing, only to eventually arrive at something that looks like this. This is abstraction. In order to understand what's happening here, you have to backtrack to figure out which animal's greet method is actually being called, and finally you'd arrive at the concrete logic. So what we have here is our logic buried under a million lines of infrastructure. And you might even argue that this hurts code readability. Well, it depends. You see, if we only have two animals, all of this extra infrastructure just causes bloat and makes the code difficult to reason about. So in that case, we'd probably be better off with something simple like this. But what about when we have many more animals? Well, if we were to stick with the simple solution, we'd need to extend this statement for every animal. And as you can see, this is getting quite long. Not to mention, the behavior for each animal is no longer encapsulated within its own class, which means that if we need to use the animal's greet behavior in some other part of the code, we'd need to redefine it in another statement in that other part of the code. And we'd need to do this every time. And if you're thinking, why don't we just use a map to associate each animal with its greet behavior, then in other parts of the code we can just use that map, then you're missing the point entirely. Printing out some string is an oversimplification of an animal's greet behavior. You need to imagine a real-world scenario where each animal has some greet behavior that differentiates it from the other animals. And that behavior involves going through some steps. So it seems that as the number of animals increases and the usage of each animal's greet behavior across the code base increases, the so-called simple solution isn't really so simple anymore. In this case, does abstraction hurt or improve code readability? Well, if we know that an animal must implement the greet behavior and encapsulate that logic within its own class, we no longer need this long statement, and getting rid of this long statement reduces cognitive load when reading the code. Simply put, if it's an animal, it has a greet method. And if you need to know a specific animal's greet behavior, you can just search for its class. Furthermore, if you're reading through the code similar to how we were reading through the code in the beginning of the video to get a top-level understanding, do you really need to know the implementation details of greet? I'd argue that the name greet gives us enough information for a top-level understanding. And if it doesn't, you can just check one implementation to get a general idea of what greet is doing, since all implementations will just be different flavors of the same thing. So back to the original question, does abstraction hurt code readability? Well, it depends.